David, I didn't fully explain your role. I talked about your business role, but you're also a key position with the American Society of Civil Engineers. You're the liaison to the ISO 55000 US tag.
Yes, yes. You know, I've been in ASCE for quite some time, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and I was the past president, 2019 president of the Utility Engineering and Surveying Institute. Because utility engineering is very, what it says, involved with utilities, asset management's always been a major emphasis on UESI, and we had the opportunity to become a voting member of the US tag, and in doing so we represent become the ASCE representative. So I work with our government affairs division, I work with other institutes, and just ASCE corporate in general. But yeah.
So the governance, that's really important because we want to have an impact, and we want to partner with ASCE. As a matter of fact, earlier in the year, we did provide some language that I think you incorporated into materials that you presented to ASCE, and we would like to have this board go with you with all your hats on in any way to help support our message. So
yep.
Appreciate that activity. So good. Tacoma Zach did join us, but I first introduced Jennifer, so let's let Jennifer go first here.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we represent two firms. Uberlytics is a company that works with organizations to help them build better asset management programs. So we coach through to certification. We specialize in criticality and risk analysis. Great to see you talk about the importance of criticality, Mark. And then MentorAMP is a asset management software solutions company, and we have a complete suite that supports that.
And coaching through to certification means you have helped an organization get ISO 55001 certified.
Yes,
Raytheon.
we worked with Raytheon in the, I believe it was fall of 2019 to successfully achieve certification in under 9 months. It was very, very quick. Tacoma can speak more than that.
You honor us by being a member of the ALN Board of Directors. So thank you for that.
Thank you. My privilege and great opportunity to have been part of the ALN for the last number of years, and was honored to be asked to be on the board and just support the mission of the ALN.
And before we get to Hugh, Tacoma was able to join us. Thank you for jumping off your earlier client meeting to join. Do you want to add anything to what Jennifer said?
I'm not really sure what I could possibly add to that. She does a wonderful job of explaining succinctly and clearly what it is that we actually do. So I actually was engaged in a pre-criticality review for customers up in Canada. So, but Jen epitomizes what we would actually be doing by the way in which she said it. And as you can tell, my babbling going on is the reason why she's better at it than I am.
So Tacoma's an engineer, David's an engineer, Mark's an engineer. Mark, is that what you got your degree in, engineering?
No, computer information systems.
Oh, even better, which is a form of engineering anyway. And Hugh Sinclair is an engineer, and as I said, he's the Asset Management Division Director. Is that the actual title, Hugh?
Yes, I'm Division Manager for Enterprise Asset Management. So I'm a civil and environmental engineering by trade, and I've been in asset management for quite some time now. And in the evolvement of that, and certainly when we're talking about how asset management and the needs for what infrastructure provides, especially in the utility space, how that has evolved, certainly the context of understanding the impact of the work that you do is something that needs to be embedded within the training that you receive. As engineers, we're really focused on being problem solvers, but problem solvers in more of the structural, I would say straight on sense, versus really understanding the social context of the infrastructure we design, maintain, and really go about the process of doing it that way. Outcomes are important for engineers, and I think the human social capital portion of it is certainly one part that we could do more of.
So you've talked with us on our equity panels and have a great overview on that perspective in asset management. Can you tell us a little bit about your nuts and bolts daily job asset management activities to kind of start this off? Because I think what you express as issues that can be addressed or you are addressing with asset management would be helpful for other water utilities to hear and think, oh, maybe we can do something like what Hugh's doing.
Yeah, sure. So WSSC Water has been one of, I would say we've been one of the first ones out of the gate with asset management. We've had the program in place now for somewhat 10 going 11 years. I oversee the entire asset management program for the utility, covering all of our portfolios, vertical and linear assets, with staff that's dispersed throughout the organization to do that. So my daily job really is about putting the pieces together and designing and implementing the strategy of asset management. We've done the early lift of where most utilities were for a long time, which is really just finding out what you had. And then really moving into establishing your triple bottom line criteria as it is. Really, as I see it right now, what we're trying to do is to really reframe asset management into what is more of a mature process, getting a little bit closer towards ISO 55000, what it really is, where asset management is not necessarily just used to drive capital investment, but is really utilized in terms of how we really describe and contextualize operational management. So we're making effects not only on operating with capital, but more importantly on decision-making processes. So especially with regards to equity, one of the things that we're doing right now is that my team currently right now, we're working on a process to implement an equity metric within our CIP prioritization criteria that we utilize for the asset management program. At WSSC Water, asset management actually oversees the prioritization of all of our capital investment. So it has quite a lot of context and impact in terms of how that's done. What we're trying to do at this point now is that we're trying to reframe what is really the social and economic portion of our prioritization criteria to really embed within that what are information that we can utilize that emphasizes equity. The good thing for that we found so far is the fact that the US Census data allows us to really establish with our jurisdictions that we serve what are equity focus areas, which are really based on census tracts. And that in itself utilizes a lot of the local and state government information, which are indicators that are embedded there to really highlight the areas within our service area that have the highest propensity of inequity. So in doing that now, what we're looking to do is to integrate that geographical analysis into our project selection process to allow for those projects itself to really have the additional emphasis on equity in return on investment for those projects, thereby allowing them to have a secondary prioritization, or even more than that, a better context in the decision-making process. Later on, we're looking to see how we can then establish that into the engineering implementation process, which we think will certainly be a little bit more difficult in terms of doing that, because really what we're doing at that point is changing the frame of reference for decision makers, but also optimizing the process so that it's a little bit more responsive to the needs of equity. Because certainly in the context of engineers and project managers, you're really given a scope of work to complete. However, unfortunately, in many cases, in most utilities, it is really outsourced the human context of what that project is about. What we're trying to do is to really embed that equity perspective into the project process so that we can be a little bit more agile in our response and making decisions as to what projects get done, what's the prioritization that we utilize for them, and really our flexibility in the scope to ensure that what we're really doing is providing an equitable level of service for all of our customers.
That's excellent. Do any of the panelists have a question about Hugh's day-to-day work that we can talk with you about before we kind of open up to the whole panel? Go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, you know, at WSSC, I was just kind of curious, right off the bat, you said, responsible for vertical, and linear assets, which I was too at Colorado Springs Utilities. So what percentage, or I dare say success rate, but clearly there's a big difference between treatment and network, assets, and just the staff, the certifications, the materials, all that. And maybe a comment or two about percentages or implementation success rates in either of those two perspectives.
Yeah, sure. So we started a program, I'd say starting off with both linear and vertical at the same time. Certainly based on condition assessment technology, linear has really taken off. Not only because of the fact that at the time we were not only navigating a consent decree, which really drove the prioritization of linear inspection on sewer, right? However, we were also partnering with many of our partners on the linear water inspection side, certainly on large PCCP transmission. We have a premier program in the country when it comes on to that, that we've developed with Pure Technologies and others over a long period of time. So just the availability of condition assessment information, which is really the bedrock of what you utilize for your medium and long-term, long-range recommendations, that program has evolved. I think one of the issues that we certainly have realized in terms of on the vertical side, when you have shorter lifespans and when you have a lot of redundancy, your need to develop a strategic platform in terms of your strategy that is sound becomes a little bit more difficult. So vertical in itself has been a heavier lift because trying to find that balance between redundancy, most of our facilities, as with most utility vertical facilities, you have several layers of redundancy that's in there. But also the difficulty in that is in properly navigating a process of assigning what is your not only probability of failure, but really what are the effects of that, right? Your consequence of failure is a lot harder on vertical because if you take a treatment plant, for example, usually if you're gonna have a failure that for most utilities is gonna be seen as something that's of realized consequence, it takes a series of failures on a treatment train to really realize that. Whether you're either gonna blow your permit limit or you're gonna have some kind of discharge violation, or you're really going to have a severe reduction in capacity that's going to affect your capability to meet your treatment volume. That in itself becomes a little bit more difficult. And over time, what we've learned as well is that it's a little harder to navigate on the vertical end because the reliance on human knowledge, because these plants have been, it's a very close-knit staffing setup with people who've been there for a very long time. There's intimate knowledge from the operator side and from the maintenance side. That in itself made them a little bit harder to become more reliant on what they perceived in the beginning as asset management being outsourcing of their operational knowledge. But we found a happy medium over time by providing proven use cases as to how that can be done. But certainly, I don't think our experience is anything different than anyone else when it comes on to that. And certainly, part of what drives asset management on linear is because the consequence of failure is a lot easier realized for customers than it is on the plant, right? Most customers will not know if you have a blowout of a treatment train, or if you have a filter bed that's gone foul and you're experiencing operational issues, unless you have to issue a boil water notice or you have some other major mitigation that you have to do. So that in itself kind of sometimes tailor the organizations to really look on where they can get, at least in their perception, the best return in value for asset management. And that's usually on linear.
You always blow me away, Hugh, and now you're blowing me away with the technical side of things. That's great. Did that answer your question, David?
Oh yeah. Well, and launch is 3 more, but I'll potentially I'll let Jennifer and Zach and Mark step in. But I think maybe I would press Tacoma to. I know he's got a comment. Hugh, you mentioned that risk in vertical might be a little more difficult in a plant. And you mentioned criticality, and that's something I see, that's something Tacoma sees. When we talk about risk, especially in networks, everyone jumps to condition because it's
Right.
cool, it's sexy. We got all these new inspection techniques and toys, you know, and I've even blogged on, you know, the forgotten step of criticality, you know, and a tenet of asset management is defining criticality. And
Yeah.
so many people just gloss right over it because they're like, one, it can be hard, as you mentioned, right? It's like, that's kind of hard because I actually have to make choices now. I have to actually, you know, put my neck out there that this is a critical component, and I have to understand that process. And that's why I like Mark's paper on ISO is, you know, there's a framework of helping you kind of go down that path. But Tacoma, you want to kind of jump in a bit on criticality and what you've seen?
Sure. Thanks for putting me on the spot.
Of course.
Now, you know, I was just on a call this morning, and you know, we always sort of circle back to actually the word risk, and to take the notion of probability out of it for now. I know that seems impossible, but you know, the idea, risk is a very personal thing for agencies. It's very personal for their stakeholders. There is a certain tolerance that those who receive the services will bear under, and then there's also a set, you know, that they won't. And it's kind of like, you know, what are they signing up for? Same thing with agencies. They are sensitive to the local environment, to the political environment, to the regulatory environment, to what the expectations are, to their commercial obligations if they are a regional plant and they're, you know, sending water to other cities or taking sewage. So from that perspective, you know, we're always very aware of the notion that it must reflect the local community and what they feel is going to significantly impact their level of service, which is the other part, is that, you know, we go back to is that, hey, it's a mix of, yeah, we want to send people home the same way they showed up, like safety, but there's also the component of level of service, and how do we define that? There was a debate I was in not an hour ago about, well, we have to provide water at a particular pressure and a particular flow rate. Well, sure, but is that an instantaneous number, or can you blip it for 10 minutes, or what happens after an hour, or what happens after 4 hours? So there's a lot of things to consider in these factors that have to be defined in the early stages and very clearly articulated, but they must be related back to the levels of service and the stakeholders involved. So they had this wonderful, and this happens over and over again, so I'm not picking on anybody in particular, but they had this lovely complex matrix of all these things. And my question was like, hey guys, where does any of this stuff come from? Does this actually represent anything that you guys have a relationship with your community and a relationship with your stakeholders, that this is what you're obligated to do? Because if it isn't grounded in reality, if it isn't grounded in what their expectations are, it becomes a lovely academic exercise, but it's not going to deliver the results that you're looking for. And Hugh, you guys have a very, you know, advanced program there, and that's actually really cool. I did have a question that I'm going to piggyback on the end related to what you had said, but you know, David's comment is a nice segue into it. I cannot stress enough, though, that without doing an appropriately set up criticality review, which then feeds into understanding where your risk is, because you have to take the likelihood of the events into account. Without that, this was a mantra that we had at where I used to work. Without that, you can't start an asset management program. Because if one of the 4 key pillars is making risk-based decisions, then it has to start at some point. One of the 4 corners of the building has to be a criticality review that is grounded in reality, and it's grounded in the stakeholders and the interest groups involved and your levels of service. So, which leads me then to a question I had for you, Hugh, and that was, I found it fascinating, not just fascinating, but important as well. But I'm really curious about how WSSC, what are the metrics or the KPIs or the measuring sticks that you guys use that defines equity? So I'll give you an alternate example that we often find when we do these analyses on systems, like horizontal systems, whether it's sewage or wastewater, is immaterial. But we often look and say, okay, where are the hospitals located, and where are the fire stations located, and where is law enforcement located, and where are the schools located? The various key elements of a city or a society where very important services are, including actually retirement communities and hospice care. So where are those located, and what kind of a design element do we have? And then those seem to distill to the top, and then there's like everything else. But I'm curious to know, when you define equity, how are you guys defining that, and what are the metrics that go into that that will reshape that part of the analysis?
That's a good question. So first up, the fact about it is that at least what I had to do for executive team was really to establish one thing. Equity is not an objective metric, right? It is very contextual for not only stakeholders, but internal internal stakeholders as well. So what we had to do then was really to understand who are we really trying to serve and what we're trying to meet. So establishing that in that context, what we did is that we engaged with our local jurisdictions that we serve, who in themselves had a lot of work that they were doing on establishing equity metrics. What we realized is that they had done a lot of work over the last 5-7 years in terms of utilizing census data with key indicators in the census data, where we're talking about everything from looking on socioeconomic background in terms of poverty levels, how many kids are taking school lunch, transportation availability, everything else that they utilize in terms of their growth metrics to say, okay, these are areas that we realize that we need to provide more services. What we decided to do, and really it took some lift for me to convince everybody internally, is that there's no need for the utility to define equity on its own. What we're really trying to do at this point is to really lean into the equity definition for the communities that we serve. And I think really this is where the break for most, especially water utilities, because of somewhat of the monopolistic mindset that we have, is that we don't think of ourselves as a service business. We usually think of ourselves as a product-driven operation. But if you reframe it as a service business, it's really about the stakeholders that you're trying to meet, given a specified level of service to. So in that, we're able to really remove ourselves from the definition of equity, right? And really more look into how are we going to utilize these equity focus areas defined by Montgomery County and Prince George's County, and then layer on our process. So internally, what I tried to establish is that what we're going to do is to really to have an equity lens versus defining equity. We're going to utilize that definition externally and then allow that to inform our process as to where we can actually utilize equity as a decision maker in the process. But I can tell you, and you'll probably realize this as well with many of the clients that you talk to, because equity is such a charged element. In many cases, what tends to be the usual whiplash effect is, well, how can equity take precedence over operational resilience? It's really not. What we're really talking about here is that it is another element within all of the elements that we evaluate to figure out if there is really the best decision to be made. So in doing that, what we certainly are trying to find here is the balance between the two. At least in the water space, in talking to Denver, who's been doing it as the same way as us, in Seattle and many other areas, it's really a difficult lift. But I think that what we're doing right now, this year is going to be our first year where we pilot the equity prioritization factor in our CIP budget for this upcoming round. And really, the important part of that is to contextualize this as it's going to be an iterative, phased process, because even the definition of equity is going to transform over time. So what we were trying to do is really just to create that expectation that we're going to grow with this over time versus trying to, in many cases, people want to knock it out apart from the beginning. And really, I believe that's a recipe for failure.
Can I rephrase it, Tacoma, and just say, how do you establish the hierarchy between a hospital and elderly care and a school and the fire? How do you do that?
So the thing is,
I'll tell you that in a sec. Who are you asking the question, Mike?
To Hugh, but
okay, sorry, go ahead. I've got a follow-up question.
The thing with that, right? And the hard part in the technicalities of that is that we realized very early in the process that there are certain either service accounts or facilities that have to get maximum impact score. Why? Because of their reach is really so dispersed that there's no real way to properly codify within a geographical area that then you can correlate that to specific equity outcomes. one of our treatment plants one of our filtration plants services about 75% of our entire service area, right? So in trying to really say, hey, this one is more important than that one, and also looking on hospitals and other areas that really have a dispensed service footprint that they have, those projects, or in terms of those criteria around projects that support that, we've looked at those as getting maximum equity impact. What we really see as where equity will have its greatest lift is really going to be in what are more projects that are relational in terms of their value. Changing the pipe on this street over here versus that street over there, right? Or doing that pump station upgrade here versus over there, and really what are the context of it. As I said yesterday, the one thing as well that I'm trying to do internally is really to bring an awareness as to the power of advocacy that drives inequity, right? Because in many cases, what is not seen or understood, and we're trying to, that's not necessarily asset management's role, but it's asset management's capability to identify the gap in the objective framework, is the fact that in many cases, the advocacy groups tend to be from areas that have the socioeconomic bandwidth to show up and to bring persistent pressure, right? For areas that have high levels of inequity, those communities don't necessarily have that bandwidth to show up to the community meetings to really put pressure on the system to really get those outcomes, or be informed enough to understand what is the return on their customer investment that they should get. So trying to ensure that we establish a clear line between what asset management can do versus outcomes that are beyond asset management, that was critical in doing that.
I got a question. And this is cool. So maybe the question's not cool, I don't know, but the topic's cool. So Hugh, I've got a question. The net outcome is the net outcome that everybody gets a minimum level of service, and minimum is maybe the wrong, connotes the wrong idea. In other words, it is a standard below which it is not acceptable. So everybody, regardless of socioeconomic, position, gets a minimum level of service, which is that which must be maintained by the utility overall. And it leads me back into actually something that is in the wording of what we're describing. We're not talking about private infrastructure. We're talking about public infrastructure.
Yes.
If it's public infrastructure, there is no variance, technically speaking, between the person the lowest on the socioeconomic scale versus somebody who has, unlimited resources and might be able to apply lots and lots of pressure. I've seen this a bunch of times, and I'm glad you guys are doing this, because I've seen this a bunch of times. Some famous person, basketball star, movie star, whatever, will call an agency up at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, says, I want my meter off, I want my meter on, and they jump and go because they exert pressure on a local board of a water agency or this and that. But somebody who's struggling, they don't have the same pull or the same clout. And that is something that is when you look at the word public infrastructure, that's something where something's gone wrong, where there should be equal access, equal minimum of level of service. So
yeah,
applaud you guys for doing that.
So what the first thing I had to do internally, and really, I've been really pushing this, and Mike knows this because I've been on this, broken record for quite some time. The fact that water equity is really equity on the level of service, just as you've said, right? Where we're talking about that equity in water is the capability of all customers to realize the same net return in terms of level of service, regardless of your capability to pay. For far too long in the water space, equity was defined by affordability, right? Being capable of paying for poor service is not equity, right? And certainly this is where the infrastructure side of it has now been somewhat revealed, and the context of that has been framed. I try to frame it as this in terms of how I was trying to bring people along. If we take Flint or Newark as an example, right? In the technical perspective of the engineering decisions that they made, it wasn't really outside of the realm of what was technically sound to make those decisions. However, the context of the socioeconomic impact and the water equity perspective was sorely lacking. So in that sense, this is really where, David, you have that break between technical knowledge and socioeconomic impacts. And the problem with that is the fact that because the two are disconnected, right? In most agencies, you have an intergovernmental relations office, you have customer service, you have all of those. The most an engineer does is really shows up to a community meeting to really answer the technical questions as to why you place it on this side of the street versus that side of the street, the size of the pipe, or otherwise. What they're really not understanding or contextualizing either in their scope development, design, or implementation is really what is the outcome that's necessary from a level of service perspective for that customer. Outside of what is, the glossing KPIs, right? I've been pretty vocal for quite some time over the fact of there's a lack of context around the KPIs that most utilities use, which is the AWWA standard, right? Numbers of breaks per 100 mile, right? Number of SSOs, basement backups, or otherwise. Those are not equal, right? If you have a basement backup in a low income community who does not have the bandwidth to really know or deal with the mitigation and the time of response, that impact is way higher than it is for a community where pretty much your basement, you're going there maybe once or twice a week. That space is not really utilized. The impact on you is different. That's really where water equity and level of service comes in, because you're right. Inherently, utilities are driven by the fact that they are government structures in many cases integrated into local governments, which then respond to voter or representative pressure, right? The issue is that we've never really understood the context of how that comes downstream. Because in many cases, what we see is that organization and your capability to advocate is what really allows for you to realize your level of service. And otherwise you don't. That is exactly why you don't have lead pipes in areas that have high socioeconomic return. It is almost always in areas of depressed socioeconomic outcomes where you find these poor or egregious level of service deficiencies.
So I was going to draw it back to Mark's presentation. I think the most important slides you had in your presentation, Mark, was on alignment and talking about, activity being aligned to the ultimate, reason for the agency existing. And I think that's one of the key principles of ISO 5000 that starts to help address all of these, competing interests, challenges. How do we make decisions? How do we address risk? But that idea of starting with why do we exist? What is our level of service obligation? And then having processes through asset management programs or whatever that align decisions, activities, priorities against securing that level of service, and realizing meeting our mandates. So I think alignment is one of the very important themes.
Almost like objectivizing and anonymizing the information results in equity. It's like if that makes sense. If I'm comparing pipeline A replacement versus B, the people making the decision should have, if they have no idea where A and B are at, and then they're making a decision
of context,
free of context.
I kind of like to it's kind of an extension of that, but I'm kind of, my question's directed at Mark, and then Hugh, maybe you can jump in with that, but back to the context of the white paper, ISO and treatment. The one thing I found, Hugh, I found your comment about that the asset management really took off in network, the distribution collection versus the treatment plant and vertical side. I always found, and I did forced service, so I did generation and treatment and such, but I found that it was almost easier in the plant confine, because everything within the fence we controlled. And so if you look at that, assets have an intent to serve, assets outside of the fence served customers, but there were, telco digging lines, and there were railroads, and there was, lightning and storms and wind and people doing all sorts of things that we couldn't control. But yet inside the fence was pretty much a micro controlled environment versus the macro. And so I'm kind of curious, Mark, the question, with asset management, this kind of the organizational context, this leadership, we were talking about line of sight on a different call. I think the ISO framework applies to both, vertical and linear in the context of that relationship, some of the hierarchical relationships. But any thoughts on, kind of the micro controlled environment where assets, serve other assets within a plant and they're engineered as opposed to these humans getting in the way. It's still very complex, lots of moving parts, but, any thoughts on how we kind of apply asset management inside the plant versus asset management, outside the plant in the network? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree with what you're saying on the difference. I very much align it towards the concept. I'm a big person that doesn't believe very much in OEM maintenance, because the OEM always tells you go inspect for damage to such and such. And I go and inspect it today and it's not damaged. And it's like, okay, great. Doesn't mean it's not going to be damaged tomorrow. Right. So it's more about, okay, identifying the risk, identifying what's going to happen and planning for the eventuality and being able to respond quickly. So when you're talking about the linear assets and the human and other people being able to interfere with it, we just need to be able to, frankly, you just have to be able to react quickly, detect when it happens, then react quickly to the failure. Whereas, as you said, within the fence ones, now we can get into condition monitoring. As Hugh mentioned, there's a lot of redundancy, probably entirely too much redundancy. I was going to ask him a question about the potential for RAM analysis on the plant. Looking at the redundancy, looking at the potential for failure and downtime, and do you have the right number of assets in there to be the most efficient? But I hope that answers the question on those assets somewhat, maybe.
So David, I think I have a little bit of a different view, right? I think asset management, if we look back on 10, 15 years ago, when asset management was really starting to emerge in water utilities, or utility more than anyone else kind of realized the catalyst that was out there that was driving it, which for us, we had a massive failure for PCCP line on River Road, which really drove the context of the public to say, okay, how are you managing your assets? It became this large conversation nationally around the crumbling water infrastructure and the need to do something different, right? And working at the same time, Steve Albee with the EPA was really bringing on board a lot of what was this new thing from Australia and New Zealand, talking about asset management and doing things differently. I think what we found over time is really that the advancement that we really needed was really the space that Jennifer and Tacoma really occupy, and the fact that context of information is the most important thing in asset management, right? Because what happens inherently is that utilities have been around for a long time, or utilities 105 years old. Mm-hmm. And with that existing for so long, you tend to kind of believe your own hype that you're really good at making decisions, right? And what asset management really challenged was the efficiency perspective of utilities. Are you necessarily equipped to really deliver efficiency and level of service return for your customers with the lowest cost, right? And utilities were never designed or governed in that way before. Utilities inherently, it is something that I believe is really a consequence of a lack of competitive environment, where it's really run in many cases like federal agencies, right? You have appropriations that come down and you try to utilize that capital in the way that you see best fit to realize some outcome that you have. However, it is just that I try to, in the early days of trying to explain asset management, I tried to utilize it internally, especially in plants, as trying to tell technicians that asset management is like GPS, right? You're doing the same job. You're going from A to B. 20 years ago, you would have to turn on the radio and find your traffic, have your ADC map book and your AAA map, right? You'd need to call somebody who knew the local area to find out the best routes to reroute in case of anything, right? And you'd have to be doing all of this information, pulling information from all these different sources. But you, the human, would have to do all of the context to make the best decisions real time. Asset management in itself now, what it does is that it's taking all of that information, operational, strategic, information, financial information, and otherwise. And like your GPS is pulling all that information together. You're still going from point A to point B, but now you have situational awareness, right? You're able to reroute. You know your expected time you're going to get there, right? You can actually make decisions based on what's happening in front of you and understand impact and outcome based on that. That is really the bridge that allowed them to see perspective differently, because now they understood that we're not actually talking about you doing things drastically different. We're just asking you to be more informed to make decisions, because right now it's too reliant on your 20, 30 years of experience, right? And plants are getting more complex. Your expectations in terms of customers are really changing. In my perspective, especially on the water end, one missing piece that I think is going to make asset management so critically important going forward, we're serving the same customers that have now redefined what is their essential service. Recent surveys show that ISP providers are actually what customers think of as their most essential service, right? Water in itself, because of its reliability, has really fallen down the totem pole in terms of where that is. However, the expectation, because that customer expectation has now shifted, and especially because the impact for us was slower because water accounts are usually based on home ownership. Understanding now that the millennial generation moving into their prime homeowning years, and is going to be the largest generation with the largest amount of accounts that's going to be there, their expectation of what do they get from their water utility is going to be drastically different. We're starting to see that on the billing side, but we're definitely going to start to see that in terms of their expectations on level of service return that they expect from utilities. And asset management is the only way we'll be able to really bridge that gap, because the old model is not going to fit the new expectation.
Oh yeah, doing electric, gas, water, wastewater, God forbid, HBO went down and the TV, they could deal without water for a day and not take a shower because they had, a Coke or something in the fridge, or, that was still cool. But yeah, don't mess with that, the entertainment ability for customers. Yeah, definitely sympathize with that.
I would just observe on the sort of network versus plant debate. One of the things we always hear and say about water, in further to that, is the invisibility of it. Not just because it's buried, but because we take it for granted, and so they, like you said, the ISP is more important because everyone just assumes water will always be there. One of my observations is that when we're at water conferences and stuff, and people are talking about asset management, usually the scope of that asset management is the network and pipe condition assessment. In my view, I think plants are overlooked, and I'm going to take one of Tacoma's lines. What's the point of a sewer collection system if you're not actually treating the sewage? And what's the point of the network distribution system if you don't have clean water to go through it? I think our water and wastewater treatment plants are due some attention and well-applied asset management.
One piece that's missing, and you brought up a good point, Jennifer. I think the part of it that made it slower on plants, and I experienced this myself, is that because plants inherently as how they were designed, you had an operating room with a lot of SCADA information. People equated that to asset management, right? So in terms of their resistance to moving the dial on that, they're like, well, I have situational knowledge. I know the temperature gauge over here. I know the flow rate. I know the voltage meter. I know all of that stuff. So they thought that really was asset management. Whereas otherwise, when you look on it in terms of out in the network, there was less information available and more consequence for the risk, in terms of not necessarily that one was more dangerous than the other one. It was really more of the fact that one was realized a lot earlier than the other one, right? Customers out of water is much easier for people to understand and then say that that's risk, versus saying, hey, look, if you have this pump running lower, you're going to blow your permit. Well, it's not apples to apples comparison in terms of how people look on it. Just based on the fact that one's external pressure, another one is just internal resilience.
Perception.
Going back to the original question, if I could just chime in for a sec, the difference between the two networks, and now I'm speaking not so much as what we currently do, but have as a previous asset owner. And that is, and this is again where I think some of the magic of ISO comes from, or at least asset management as a codified standard. And that is if you're looking at, those 4 pillars, and I think 2 or 3 of them are absolutely key. If you're looking at wanting to make risk-based decisions, well, then you have to look at both sets of vertical versus horizontal. And some of the information that goes into them is going to be a little bit different. Whereas vertical plants are more complex, the net effect of losing a main trunk line is a massive impact on it. So, and the network is kind of sometimes kind of looked like as a tree. Everybody and their uncle knows the stuff that's going in and out of the plant is the most important piece of pipe, because then everything is affected. So they're different. The context, as Hugh pointed out again, is relatively, well, is significantly important in understanding these things and making those decisions. But at the end of the day, it really comes back down to, again, there's a common element that goes across them, and that is what is the plant, what are the facilities, what is the utility in its aggregate intended to do? Why does it exist, and what level of service is it supposed to do? We kind of joke around about it a little bit. We used to say always, never don't make clean water, and never don't take sewage. And regardless of whose basement gets flooded, you just don't do that sort of stuff. But we all live in this world where, unfortunately, if the mayor's mother's basement gets flooded, well, who do you think gets first dibs at crack at having people come and fix this thing, right? It's unfortunate. It's one of those things that's part of life. But when we look at it, the difference in those two systems, again, the vertical versus the horizontal, that's where I think it's really cool, is that the codified system allows us to address both in the context and the unique engineering elements of it. Underground assets are always posing an unrealized risk, and I say unrealized or a poorly understood risk, because the last time we saw it might have been several years ago. And we know facilities that are, or utilities that have a 50 and a 100-year cycle time for by the time they get back to looking at that same piece of pipe. Versus vertical assets, you can pretty well walk around them and see them, but they're way more complex, and you also have much faster failure rates because of the dynamic aspects of those assets. I mean, a pipe has a much more limited set of failure modes, and I know we're getting technical here, but versus a centrifuge or a complex split case pump. So the nice part though is that if the approach says make risk-based decisions, okay, well now I have to make an appropriate set of judgment calls on both types of systems. How do I measure the risk? Get alignment. Okay, well, that's kind of unified. That's the same thing. That's making sure that whatever everybody is doing at the field level absolutely addresses 100% of the time what the overall objectives of the agency is, so that there's a vertical alignment, not just the horizontal alignment between the different functional groups. And then when you look at the other ones about leadership and that kind of stuff, it's cool. But those two particular elements are common, and they're a bit of a unifying aspect for how to make appropriate asset management decisions in both realms. So I think that's one of the geniuses of the standard, because it also takes into account data. I mean, we haven't even touched about that, information and the protection of that information regarding what's actually in the GIS. How do I protect that information? Because if it's gone tomorrow, well, I'm kind of starting from ground zero. It is as much an asset. My data and the information that it generates is as much an asset as the physical asset out in the field. We used to say, if you can touch it, it's an asset. Well, now we say, if you understand, if you can think about it, it's an asset. Just like I think some aspects of reputation, the ability to self-report, if you have that kind of a trust within you and the regulatory agencies that govern your area, that is an asset actually to be valued. Because if you don't have that trust factor, it gets to be an uglier day.
That's an excellent comment, Tacoma, and exactly the type of thing that would be ideal for the ALN Water and Wastewater Asset Leadership Board to be bringing forward and bringing into discussion in associations and other conferences. So in the last 10 minutes, I would like 2 things. One, there's a question that I think also advances this board direction that we'd like to have occur. It's about levels of service. It came earlier when Hugh was talking about this. Water treatment plays critical role in public health. So how do we show water utilities the ROI of investing in better service delivery and thus increasing public health? So now we're breaking down silos between different aspects of the city, which is what Marty Rowland's standard does, helps level the understanding of how to deal with the complexity of operating a municipality. So Jennifer, if you could take a crack at that, even if you don't know if ROI is the best approach of.
I've been looking at that question and wondering how to answer it. I think one of the key things for water utilities isn't so much the ROI as in their accountability to their stakeholders. And so a utility does have obligations to manage their budget, but their level of service is usually articulated in terms of a responsibility to public health. And so when we connect asset management to their ability to maintain their level of service and protect public health, I think that's when we can connect the dots on the value of asset management to utility management. I'd like to know what David thinks of how he would answer that question.
Well, yeah, a couple of things. Thank you, and I'll try to be as quick as possible. And we had an amazing panel yesterday, and the topic of equity and infrastructure being led by former Governor O'Malley, and Hugh was in that, and it's one of the most exciting panels I've been on because we talked about kind of real stuff, if you will. Couple comments. I think the whole the ISO and to Mark's presentation about leadership, some of the things we highlighted yesterday, I think that spills into today is that level of service. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I'm equating more and more, and it's become my understanding that public health and public infrastructure, are indeed inherently tied. And I think we have kind of forgotten that. And Hugh and I kind of talked about yesterday as in engineering, we've had the mechanical, we've had the objective, we've had all the training on infrastructure, but we've lost the human training. And more, I think we bring that back, especially as we get into equity and we get into social determinants of health. And what the water utility, it's the only utility we actually put in our body, right? And we've been so, I think, blessed with our Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act. We take it for granted, but we're finding out new things on PFAS and everything else that it's like, oh, maybe we can't. And COVID has just really changed our understanding of public health and various services. And so, I think that's when we look at, the code of ethics in civil engineering, protect the safety, health, welfare of our citizenry, we've kind of taken health for granted, and we don't think of total health. We don't think of there's physical health, but mental health, environmental health, it starts to propagate. And I think that's where Hugh was talking about how successful asset management is out in the network, because it impacts so many people directly, right? It's their home, it's their children, it's their livelihood. And so I think when we start to mingle, that as Tacoma has been saying, Mark kind of in his paper, these assets have an intent to serve. It's that level of service. We have to think of like total service levels. That customer service is not just customer satisfaction so they pay a bill, it's actual level of service that water indeed is healthy for everyone, not just affluent communities versus the most disadvantaged. And to Tacoma point, there's a level of service that you have to meet.
That's a great contribution to what I am hoping this board is going to be doing, is elevating the discussion on this. Mark, will you give a few comments on what you think the board can do to help elevate this level of discussion throughout the water industry?
I can, but I'd really want to talk to what David was mentioning.
Okay, go right ahead. We can go into overtime. We do not have to stop right on the hour. So
I think it's the level of service thing is perfect, right? And I think it all comes up into how we determine what we're going to do to maintain the asset. And in simple terms, it's what is the functional requirement of those assets, and establishing a functional requirement that meets the health standard means that if it fails to meet that, now we have a functional failure. So we're trying to avoid functional failure. So we just simply tie that health impact portion, whatever causes the health impact, if we hit that, that's a functional failure. So how are we going to prevent or mitigate the consequences of that functional failure? So I think that's my answer to that one. I think that would help tie it all together from that perspective. And what we can do, I think we talked a little bit yesterday, really, how do we simplify gaining ISO 55000 compliance, right, and certification. I think, I'm just going to steal blatantly from Tacoma now. He's on the, a stepped approach. I think that's brilliant. I know we talked about the fact that you can do an asset management policy and your strategic asset management plan, and then pick some assets to do your asset management plans for and certify those assets. But still, it's almost kind of long in the process, a more baby step process that people can walk through and gain. It goes back to what I said, celebrate the achievements along the path, right? So if we give them baby steps to achieve, celebrate the achievement, it keeps it moving.
So Mike, if I may, there's one key factor here that I've been trying to highlight for a long time, but I think is critically important. When we talk about public health, the one thing that has never really been had concentrated focus is the fact that water utilities have given up on the quality fight in water. Why? Because bottled water has now established itself as the standard in terms of potable water, right? When you look on the disruptive factor of that, in the same way as what happened in the transportation sector, where your perspective in terms of your control on the market was really blinding you to the disruptive factor of other elements coming in. If you look at it now, surveys show that 3/4 of US households do not drink tap water. And when you don't drink tap water, your perspective of if it's important to you in terms of your public health, it's not going to be valued in that sense. So water has really now, at least water utility, the water coming in your pipe is now being looked on as really as a utility and not necessarily as really a public health good. Why? Because you're really looking on establishing your water intake based on Avion, Dasani, and everything else. And really what you're seeing is that the sugary drink industry realized 10 or so years ago that was a declining market. And what they did at that point is that they moved into what was water-based products. And in that time, what they've done is really captured the customer base in terms of their understanding or their perception of quality, moving away from your tap and moving straight into bottled. That in itself has really reduced the public health perspective and impact from customers who are then representing through stakeholders in terms of the importance of your water utility, right? Until water utilities actually start to understand the disruptive nature of that. What we're really facing right here is that it's a situation of the taxi cab industry before Uber and Lyft, right? Where the fact is that you had the market, you didn't recognize the disruptive factor in terms of changing the customer perspective and changing the business model. And what happens over time is that what you've done now is that you've relegated yourself into being the second tier on the market, which is exactly where we are right now. And then inherently as well, what we do is that we reinforce that issue. Let's take Flint, for example. Flint had a failure of its potable water system. What was given to the customers? Bottled water, right? So you are reinforcing the quality perspective to say that in that situation, trust the higher quality product. And let's not even talk about the fact that we don't even really realize the extracted value. Nestle pays less than $1,000 for a contract in California to extract 30 million gallons per year. Then they turn around and they settle that for $1.65 per 16 ounce. That's a net return realized nowhere else in the market for what is source water, which has to then be shared also with utilities, right? So it is really a challenging of the business model at its core, where what will have to be done here is really utilities starting to understand that customers are pretty much the top of the asset tree. And if they're really not going to study their customers and understand how they lean into customer trends, then cost pressure in terms of rate pressure will always be realized going forward, because for the last 15 years, we've been talking about crumbling infrastructure. And really at this point now, it's really becoming a diminishing return, because people's acceptance of the fact that what we're saying is that the system is crumbling has now really led them to even more dependence on what is their alternate source, which is bottled water.
That is an excellent mantra for the board to take up. I think that's great. So hopefully you can all continue, because there's some things that I know you all want to say, but Nick, will you do the official top of the hour end?
Of course. Yeah, I just wanted to thank our patron sponsors again, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group, especially ABS Group and Mark West for that presentation earlier and for sponsoring this session of the 2021 Restructuring America Building on Success web conference. We also want to thank our organizational members, especially Uberlytics and MentorAPM, for Jennifer and Tacoma Zach's time here today on this event, and for their continued support for the last few years and into the future of this and other programs. And one last plug for the ALN A55K professional certification course from the Andrew James Advisory Group. That starts November 8th. So if you want to learn more about ISO 55000 and be able to participate in your organization's implementation, please take that course. Reach out to Andrew James Advisory Group or myself or Mike. And with that, if you guys have time, we would be happy to go into overtime for a little bit.
Tacoma, before you go on, I want to emphasize that there's going to be a program next week with Lindsay Ziegler, the president of the Andrew James Advisory Group, and she's going to be talking with some of the students who have taken the course and have been A55K professional certified, and talking about how they're applying ISO 55000 and the training into their work. So go ahead, Tacoma.
Just a super quick comment, and not necessarily to gainsay anything that Hugh may have alluded to or intimated to, and definitely the bottled water market is an interesting what I used to say an outlier, but it's definitely a factor in these things. But I always go back to and say, what is the charter that the agency or the water provider has? And I almost look, and that sort of helps answer the question about return on investment, because I think sometimes we have a misunderstanding or a misplaced bias. And when we look at what's return on investment, we tend to look at this thing from a financial perspective. What's my biggest gain going to be? When perhaps the actual gain is that you are providing a level playing field. In other words, everybody who's there has the same access to the same quality of water. And the return on investment is that you're actually meeting the charter that you signed up for. And so from that perspective, I look at it as like and it's almost the part about, we talked about health, public health and the water agency. It's almost like the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. And so if we look at the water infrastructure to say, hey, we're supposed to do no harm, therefore we're not allowed to have a Flint, Michigan, or whatever else, or a Walkerton up in Canada, where people get sick from it. No, the charter is you should always make clean water that meets a minimum standard that somebody, the public health or the federal government, somebody says this is the minimum standard that you have to hit, and that is your return on investment, that you are actually hitting that, because we are not supposed to do harm with that. And I think when we create that level playing field, it takes a lot of the gyrations out of it, because it's like everybody is supposed to get it. It's a public infrastructure. So let's meet it.
So I'm actually
that's all I wanted to say.
I'm going to actually chime in here, even though I'm not in water. I'm in ISO 55000. And what Mark was saying about the transformative nature of ISO 55000, you need to, the first step is to make sure your strategic asset management plan aligns with your organizational objectives. Organizational objectives are mission. That's charter. And once you start looking at this in this holistic way and involving all stakeholders, guess what? Your charter might change. And when you realize that technology and tools and capabilities and processes are enabling things that weren't possible when your mission might have first been established, you may be rewriting your mission and Tacoma. So
well, I would even argue that there's a lot of agencies out there that don't even know what their charter is. When we go and do these, when we do these analysis, and we say, hey guys, you know, what do you guys actually have published? What are you actually supposed to do? And they're, you know, I get the deer in the headlights look. Well, we're supposed to, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I go like, yeah, but to what standard? You know, you're supposed to be making water, but to what standard and how often and who, what defines an outage and that sort of thing. And it's amazing that some of them don't even realize that there is actually a published charter somewhere that actually is the governing document, why those assets actually exist. It's amazing the amount of disconnect that there is, because then they have all these phony baloney standards that they put out there, and that's where they're trying to meet. And it just ends up being one, you know, the tail chasing the dog kind of thing to go around.
Mark, in your example, where the people were honest and said, well, we need to back up and bring this up a level, did you feel that they responded to this situation that Tacoma is describing in a positive way?
I wouldn't say it was really to the same fact that they didn't know what their charter was. I think it was more to the fact that they were siloed and realized that they needed to go back up and reorganize at a higher level. So
okay, fair. Do you think that maybe the mission or the charter could be altered or refined or anything based on the process?
it can always be changed and modified to fit.
Excellent.
That's the beauty, isn't it?
Well, you were just looking for verification of your position there.
Oh, I'm busted. Thank you.
We're not disagreeing with your position.
Continuous improvement.
Hey guys, I've got a hard stop. I'm already late for another call, so I got to run. It's been a pleasure, guys. Great seeing everybody again.
Thank you, Tacoma.
All right, bye-bye.
So go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, I think, you know, Hugh's comment is, you know, a really hard look in the mirror of ourselves when it comes to, you know, a lot of the One Water initiatives, right? And the comment about, you know, utility understanding their customers and understanding, you know, the perception and their reliance on, you know, bottled water. And yes, that you know, the response in Flint of delivering bottled water, I was trying to think, it's almost like a chicken and the egg sort of thing. They never would have needed bottled water had the city not done their due diligence and understanding the service level to the ultimate customer. And so, you know, and in various conversations that you know, the whole concept of source water, you know, I had raw water mountain delivery, and we had to look at water rights adjudications and understanding the draws of an overburdened river system, you know, mountain delivery, and how that affected our asset management. And you got to almost go to that source water and also kind of delivery water, right? So people are short circuiting the process. Just exactly what Hugh said is there's a perception that the bottled water is better regardless, and that tap water is just for cleaning things, not drinking. And that's a great point Hugh made, that I think we need to, you know, kind of add that into the water conversation when we talk about One Water and how asset management and ISO plays a role in this One Water. You know, there's, you know, we're almost extending that chain, the supply chain, into a lot of different aspects: social, legal, environmental. Great topics, Mike, for future sessions.
Excellent. Jennifer, do you want to make any comments about close and talk about future activities, potential future activities?
I would just, you know, to piggyback on David and Hugh there, you know, one of the key words is trust, and having, you know, gaining the public's trust, keeping the public's trust. And, you know, as a marketer and communicator, communication is vital. when we're talking about intangible assets, like trust, brand, image, those things that need to be incorporated into asset management systems and thinking as well. So, never a shortage of great, challenging things to discuss with this group. So I know that there'll be lots of good thinking that happens coming
Mark,
forward.
you started us. Thank you, Jennifer. Mark, you started us off with an excellent presentation. You want to make any closing comments before David and Hugh? Hugh, we'll ask you to finalize the program.
I just want to say thanks. I really enjoyed the conversation, actually. Appreciate you coming in and joining in for the entire time with us. That was great. It was really brought some interesting ideas and concepts up, and lots of challenges. Looking forward to meeting and figuring out how we're going to get beyond them.
Excellent. David?
Well, I think, Jennifer, if you were to key the whole thing into one word, that trust, and Mike, when we were preparing, language for the infrastructure plan through ASCE, we were really settling on that mantra of, public infrastructure preserves, and protects public health, but asset management is what's going to kind of instill public trust, right? So we're linking public health to public infrastructure to public trust. And I think Hugh's made a great point, that through that, or Jennifer even said, and Mark's presentation, the ISO framework, is a methodology. It's a discovery process. It's an educational process, and probably that steel thread is trust through all of it. And I think if the public trusts what we're doing with public infrastructure, public health just naturally comes through service levels. So
excellent. Hugh?
So I think Jennifer certainly brought up what I think is, and I agree with David, trust is actually the most important factor that we have here. And I think, at least in my perspective, I think water is at the point of understanding that the evolution has now really led us to really needing a revolution in the industry. And really the revolution in the industry is really going to be around the coalescing of all of these systems into a cohesive process, which is asset management. And that in itself is really just us trying to catch up to where our customers have already been, right? I think we've been inoculated from customer pressure because we don't live in a competitive environment, but certainly now, as your customers have moved ahead, their expectation has now evolved, and now we need to catch up. And through that, a structured method of having data-driven the intelligence in terms of how we manage and operate is certainly the only way that we can really bridge the gap. Because whether we like it or not, I try to tend to use what one of my colleagues, Karen Riley, always says, is that water is a cornerstone institution. It's really the first infrastructure to go in to establish a community, but it's also the one that girds it up, that it really is built on, right? And if water is seen as the essential, certainly then what we need to leverage against that public trust is all the best tools that we can to ensure that reliability is not only just there and present, but the evolvement of how water can penetrate different parts of our life continues to move forward.
Excellent. Thank you for that, that great summary. Thank you to all of our panelists for your contributions and trying to float all of the boats higher. And thank you to our attendees. You're wonderful. The engagement with questions and sticking around for the whole thing is much appreciated. And thank you, Nick, for making sure everything goes very smoothly.
No problem. It was a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
thank you.